Can you at the back hear me? No, you can't hear me. How's that? Oh, I hate these things. Right, well, first of all is Happy New Year and welcome to St Giles Parish Rooms. The reason you may realise is that we're here and not in the church is because the church is having heating installed and it'll be worth it, believe me. But for now, I didn't expect as many of you, but I am delighted. I'm sorry if you haven't got as much room as you would like, but can you all see the screen? I think that's probably the most important thing today.
It'll look better when we've turned the lights out.
Yeah.
Andrew, could you turn the light out, please? Thank you. Thank you.
Much better.
I'm afraid someone's jogged the table. It's a bit twisted.
Well, that's true, isn't it? Somebody's knocked the... it's not quite straight, the machine.
He's put it out, so he'll do it.
Could you leave it, please? Thank you.
Sorry.
That's in a little bit, but not enough to really worry, I think.
Good. I have to declare a certain selfishness on my part. Having waded through Benedictine, Ignatian, Franciscan, Celtic, and was there anything else? Spirituality, it occurred to me that I know very, very little about Dominican spirituality. So part of the reason for organising this was to put that right, because I thought if I don't know, perhaps a lot of other people don't know. And for this particular talk, I'm even more selfish, I don't mind admitting it, in that when several years ago we went to Florence for a few days, on our last morning we went to the what was a convent in northern Florence to see the Fra Angelico pictures there, and I was almost swooning with the beauty. It was utterly, utterly fantastic. And that has stayed with me, and I'm sure you're all going to be delighted with what Dr. Gamble is going to show us today, and his knowledge, which is superb. So, over to you, Nicholas.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. I feel honoured to be invited to open this series on Dominican spirituality. It's a subject very close to my heart, having been a Dominican myself, and having a particular interest in the early Renaissance, among whom I must say Fra Angelico has always been one of my greatest favourites and an inspiration. Now, first of all, I'd like to thank Georgie, who's just spoken, who has organised all this series on monastic spirituality. Excellent. Franciscan one last term, I think, which I had the pleasure of attending. I don't know why an art historian should be thought the right person to start a series on spirituality, but a lot of my Dominican brethren, who are profound theologians, needless to say, will be addressing spirituality doubtless more directly. However, it is no accident, I think, that Angelico was even in his own lifetime called the angelic painter, Angelicus Pictor, not only because of the spiritual character and inspiration of his pictures, but because he himself was apparently a most wonderful, saintly person who was it was a joy to live with in his various Dominican priories. He emanated joy, we're told. So, it seems to me that something of his own personal quality does come across in the paintings. He is, in fact, as far as I know, the only Western painter to be beatified. I think he may even be canonized now. Although there are Oriental equivalents, like the great Andrei Rublev, the icon painter of 14th century Russia, who was a saint of the Eastern Church. But I think he has the distinction of being the only painter saint produced by the Catholic West. There we see the only depiction we have of him not by himself, of course, because he is now dead. He, in the end of his life, the last 5 or 6 years, was spent in Rome painting at the behest of 2 popes. And there he died and was buried in the church of the Spanish Dominicans, Santa Maria sopra Minerva. And there is his effigy, shown in his Dominican habit. When you die, your hood is put up, lying as a Jesus, a recumbent effigy, on the stone, in a stone slab on the floor. Next, please. So this talk is going to fall into 2 parts. The first, longer part, perhaps, is going to try and distinguish some of the characteristic notes of Fra Angelico's earth, his subject matter, his iconography, his style. And the second part, I shall look at about 4 or 5 pictures in greater detail to show and wax more specifically art historical, and analyze those paintings in respect of style and provenance. So let's start. There we see a portrait of St. Dominic, the founder of the order, holding his attribute in art, which is a lily, a sign of purity. And I couldn't resist putting next to him my own patron, an image of my own patron saint. This is all one picture, of course, who is St. Nicholas. I don't know of no other picture in which those 2 saints are actually shown together. So I imagine you may have seen Dominicans occasionally walking around the streets in their habits, a white habit, a tunic and scapula and hood, and when you go out and inquire, you wear over that a black mantle called a capa nigra. And you will see lots of Dominicans in Fra Angelico's work. Not surprisingly, he got a lot of his commissions from various Dominican houses throughout Italy. And he also, for him, it was a matter of piety to put in Dominican saints whenever it seemed feasible. I was most amused when I was preparing a gallery talk for the National Gallery in London. I was examining their one and only Fra Angelico, which may be sort of school of, which shows the worship of Christ in the courts of heaven. And I would say 8 out of 10 of the saints who constitute the court of heaven turn out to be Dominicans. This shows a certain special pleading, perhaps. Next, please. It seems likely, though we aren't quite sure, that Angelico was himself trained by another monastic artist, not a Dominican, but a Camaldolese. The Camaldolese hermits were founded by St. Romuald, adapting the Benedictine rule to a more purely contemplative and indeed eremitical form of life. They lived in small huts up in the forests of central Italy, and the Abruzzi, and made their living by logging. And this monk was called Lorenzo Monaco. And we know that if not a formal apprentice, certainly as a youth, first attested as painting at the age of 17. He did actually act as a part-time assistant to Lorenzo before he, that is Angelico, entered the Dominican order. His name in the world, his baptismal name, was Guido di Pietro, and on entry, as I say, we have a reference to him as a painter in 1417, when he would probably have been 17 himself, born circa 1400. And then the next documentation is 1423, where he's referred to as Fra Giovanni da Fiesole, which was his name in religion. That was the Giovanni was the new name he was given on entering the order. And of course, Fra Angelico is his highly, I suppose, laudatory nickname, but it was neither his original name nor his monastic name. For the next 32 years after entering the Dominican monastery, or should I say priory, at Fiesole, which is a beautiful village overlooking Florence. None of you may have been there. He worked for the next 32 or so years in the service of the order and of the larger Italian Catholic Church. Halfway through his career, he was transferred to the big Dominican house which George referred to, San Marco. Not the biggest, that's Santa Maria Novella near the station. But San Marco is important because there the greater part of Fra Angelico's religious life and production as an artist took place. And eventually he was even elected prior as successor to another Dominican saint called Antonino, who became a bishop. So his election, I think, speaks for the quality of him as specifically a religious, not just his fame, obviously, as a painter. We know from other documents that together with the Carmelite artist Fra Lippi, he was recognized in his own day, in the 30s and 40s especially, as the leading painter in Florence. And according to a letter sent to Piero de' Medici, the effective ruler of Florence in 1438, by another artist called Domenico Veneziano, Domenico says, "It is a wonder he manages ever to finish a commission, so overwhelmed is he with orders, with work." Now, it seems that like many people working in a monastic milieu, his earliest training, probably by Lorenzo Monaco, might have been as an illustrator of books. Remember that the early 15th century was the last flourishing of the international Gothic style. And gradually it was supplanted by what one might call a neoclassical manner inspired by the rediscovery of the art of ancient Rome. And I think the interest for art historians about our painter is how he successfully synthesizes these two manners, and without any sense of tension, the Gothic and the new emerging neoclassical style. But if there's one Gothic art form which is absolutely characteristic, especially in monastic milieu, that is the art of the book. And here we have a Dominican missal, which is still in the library at the Convento di San Domenico in Florence. The initial S, which brings me to my first characteristic of Dominicans in general and Fra Angelico in particular, a particular devotion to the Mother of God, who you see here within the capital letter as protectress of the Dominican fraternity. You see a group of Dominicans gathered around her skirts, asking for kneeling and begging her for her intercession with her son. There's also a splendid profusion of floriate detail as well, a great swag of pink petals coming out of the corner of the initial. And you can also see lines of music. This is not just a missal to be used by religious sitting in the choir. It is in fact a singer's book. You can see the music written above the words, above the plain song notation. Next, please. Underlying the art of the book is inevitably joy. An illuminated initial is a tinted drawing. You realize the whole thing with your pen, and then you put the colour in. And I think it's very evident that in addition to his skills in manipulating space and creating a sense of mass and volume, all of which look more to the plastic arts like sculpture, realizing those effects in paint, there's also an exquisite sense of line, extremely refined, as we see from another early product, which was meant to be the frontispiece to an illuminated psalter, which shows King David kneeling and playing his harp. So beautiful and extremely refined, delicate drawing is another major characteristic of his style. And I'm sure, though we have very few examples, that preparatory drawings must underlie all his painted works. You try out the design first on a sheet of vellum, and then you translate the design onto the wall or onto the board on which the finished product is going to be realized. Next, please. Now, I once again must mention the Convento di San Marco, the Priory of St. Mark in Florence, which, as I said, is where Angelico spent the greater part of his own monastic life, because that house, which is no longer lived in by Dominicans, has been turned into the greatest collection, the museum, the commemorative museum of Fra Angelico, which contains the greatest collection of his works in the world. And every single picture you're going to see can be found in that Museo di San Marco, the museum part of the former convent. But I don't think I'm going to waste time giving attributions of place to every single picture that is not in the San Marco Museum, because it wastes time. There's only one, as I said, in the National Gallery. Some of these, he works, as I say, in many different media, but all his commissions are religious subjects. Some are frescoes painted onto wet plaster on the wall of the building, and this one, for example, is in situ. It's part of the original decoration. It's in a corridor, which you see shortly after you come in. It's near the main entrance. And sometimes he works on panel, but I'll be talking about that, how he does it, in a minute. The all true fresco is painted on wet plaster so that the tempera paints sink into the actual substance which has been bonded onto the wall, the plaster. The paint and the plaster become one, they become united, and that gives it great durability. I can even think in Russia, where you know the climate is seldom benign, especially in the winter, there are frescoes of icon frescoes, if you like, outside some of the Kremlin churches above the door, which have been unaffected by hundreds of years of bad weather. So you see that fresco is a very durable medium. This one shows St. Dominic at the foot of the cross, which points to another keynote in the spirituality of Dominicans. I've mentioned devotion to the Virgin Mary, but I would also say a particular emphasis on the absolutely, literally crucial significance of the Passion of Christ. And frequently one sees pictures of Dominican saints not just kneeling in front of a crucifix, but as if in the presence of the dying Christ, embracing the cross on which he is actually hanging. Next, please. These two are in situ. They're actually part of the fabric of the priory at San Marco. Another very popular Passion image, which evolved during the previous century, is the Man of Sorrows, Christ as the victim of the Passion, dead, but displaying his wounds inside his own sarcophagus, coffin. This is a focus for penitential prayer, whether in the home or in the church. And the one lower one is just inside the front door of San Marco. All monastic orders believe that the guest should be treated as if he were Christ himself. The stranger coming to your door is an alter Christus, another Christ, and should be treated with appropriate honor and kindness. So there you see two Dominicans welcoming Christ the pilgrim as a guest to their house, to their monastery. Next, please. And another feature of them, perhaps not quite so much today in my own experience, silence is a great necessity for religious, even chattery and voluble Dominicans. And so again, quite close to the door. Well, just when you go from the public bit of the church, of the priory, into the clausura, the enclosure, open only to Dominicans and their male guests. You see just inside that door another Dominican saint called Peter Martyr enjoining silence. Now, I think one must emphasize the piety and the devotion to prayer of our artist. We're told that he spent hours at night in contemplation. And so this art, its inspiration comes not only from study, which is one of the other great planks of Dominican life, sacred learning, but also silent prayer. St. Thomas Aquinas says two rather useful things. That the purpose of preaching, and that was the purpose of the foundation of the order of preachers, is contemplata alii stradere, to hand over to other people the fruits of contemplation. Notice he does not say intellection, though that is involved as well. Primary wisdom, as against mere knowledge, comes from something more profound than simply reading books. It comes from friendship with God. And so, in order to be a contemplative, you need silence, and that's what this picture is about. That's St. Peter Martyr, who was one of St. Dominic's earliest companions, a fierce assaulter of the heretical Cathars, or otherwise known as Albigensians. He was coming back from a preaching tour and attempting to point out the error of their ways, when an Albigensian woodsman embedded his axe in the back of his head, and that was the end of him. It's shown often in art, indeed, with the axe embedded in his skull, which adds a certain piquancy to the picture. Next, please. Well, another reason for, as it were, deriving most of one's illustrations from the museum at St. Mark's in Florence is that in the middle of his career, after he'd moved to the convent as a member of the community, Fra Angelico was called on to paint put one devotional picture, one scene from the life of Christ, usually, in each of the monastic cells. So these have a very simple and direct character. They invariably include a Dominican onlooker, a Dominican saint looking inside the picture as a witness to the scene, with whom the monk, the friar I should say rather, who occupied the cell could identify. He himself is, through his prayer, trying to get into the picture, into the meaning, as if present at the actual New Testament scene. But this is not a New Testament scene. It is part of Catholic tradition. At the end of her life, we believe Our Lady did not although she really died, she did not remain in her tomb, but miraculously it was assumed or carried up body and soul to heaven, where she was crowned by her son as Regina Caeli, Queen of Heaven. This is what's going on in the picture. The mandala is in fact not strictly almond-shaped, it's a roundel of light surrounding the two principal figures, who are also in white, representing purity and the uncreated light of the Trinity, which perfectly reflects the round frame of the picture space, which is inside a small, bare monastic room. And you can see a number of monastic saints. Needless to say, there are more Dominicans than any other kind. 3 Dominican saints, St. Francis and St. Benedict.
Can one sharpen the focus a little?
Yes, that's a good point. Sorry about that. When you're on top of it, you can't always see.
That's
Better?
yeah, much better.
Thank you.
Next, please. The Franciscan and Dominican orders were founded at precisely the same time, at the beginning of the 13th century, and according to the biographer of St. Francis, Jacopo da Veragine, at one point they actually met. They didn't say a word to each other because they just knew. They recognized each other's spiritual caliber. They silently embraced and then parted, which is what you see in the picture. So the first category of subject matter I've alluded to, which is illustrations of gospel scenes and also scenes of dogmatic importance derived from tradition, like the Assumption of the Mother of God or her coronation in heaven. But as another category is obviously scenes from the life of various Dominican saints, or just iconic representations of them, like a portrait. And there is an example. Despite what some people have said, I think that by and large at this time there were very good fraternal relations between Franciscans and Dominicans. If that were not so, St. Francis and St. Dominic would not have been painted together so often. Next, please. And there is an obvious example of a Dominican altarpiece. Christ, the Virgin and Child enthroned in the center of a triptych, an altarpiece with 3 sections, three wings, with St. Dominic, St. Peter Martyr, and on the right, holding a copy of his great Summa Theologiae, is St. Thomas Aquinas, probably the greatest Catholic theologian of the Middle Ages, who was a rather large Dominican, rather portly. Now, I might show this because it's a moment, I think, to mention that most of the commissions which were received by Angelico were for altarpieces or portable wood panel paintings. You can't paint directly onto wood. The wood was treated with size and then gesso, which is a kind of hard plaster made from gypsum, rather a little like plaster of Paris, which can be polished up to a nice shiny flat surface, onto which you put first of all your drawing, your what's called the cartoon, which will guide your hand in doing the final paintwork. That is, so one might say that this is oil. This is egg tempera. That's the medium. That means ground up mineral colours mixed with egg yolk. Egg tempera on gesso on board or panel, if you prefer. All of the altarpieces you're going to see are in this medium. So we've seen, I don't think in his maturity that Angelico went in very much for book illustration. His 2 main things are frescoes, and I've just shown you the Coronation of the Virgin, which is a fresco in one of the cells of St. Mark's Priory in Florence, and wooden panel paintings, mostly small, some very large altarpieces. Next, that's not a particularly large one. On the other hand, he is capable of working on a almost miniature scale. This image of the Virgin enthroned with St. Peter and Paul in the wings is obviously designed for private devotional use. It's what someone might have in their bedroom over their prie-dieu, their prayer stool. It must have been made for quite a wealthy patron because, as you see, the frame, which has and the platform underneath to stabilize it, are all gilded in leaf gold. Next, please. And there at the other end of the spectrum is something really enormous, a really enormous panel painting showing the Last Judgment. And as I will point out further, one of the things which is innovatory about his work is an increasingly accurate grasp of perspective. This to 2 generations before treatises were being written, mathematical analysis of how to project form in space. So the theoretical basis of doing perspective was not yet known. All this, which is extremely accurate, is done simply empirically through looking and through practice. I'm thinking about that extraordinary railway line going down the middle of the picture, which are actually a whole series of empty tombs from which the deceased has risen for judgment. You can see Christ is judged enthroned at the top of the picture. On one side you have the damned suffering eternal torment in the flames of hell, and over here you see the paradise garden. Next, please. Which brings me to another, what I see as another characteristic of Angelico, a sense of joy and celebration. In heaven, they're not just sitting around eating pâté de foie gras to the sound of trumpets. They are, in fact, dancing. His paintings are full of angel musicians, angeli musicanti, playing every possible kind of known instrument, playing harps and lutes and blowing trumpets. There's a lot of joyful music going on in heaven, and even dancing. If you're very good, you might yet get to do a slow foxtrot with an angel in the age to come. But what a delightful picture. It really is a paradise of garden with wonderful trees and bushes with gold leaves and a mass of different flowers growing in the greensward underfoot. And the uncreated glory from the heavenly city is simply streaming through the doors. Can you see those gold rays? As St. John the Divine says, the holy city needs no light because the glory of God is sufficient to illuminate it. So I think that's a really marvelous celebratory passage, picture of heaven. Next, please. And there is a musical angel. There are plenty of those in his work. That one is playing a drum. That's a tambour. Next, please. Now, I show this because one has. I want to contrast his capacity both to do things which are very simple and straightforward, with things which are multi-populated and extremely complex. This is another coronation of the Virgin, and it's obviously done for a Dominican prior, for a Dominican community, because you can see the life of St. Dominic underneath in what we call the predella, which is a strip of painting underneath the main body of the altarpiece, telling you about the life of the principal saint or saints depicted above. Next, please. This shows the refectory in the south of France, Toulouse, which was our first foundation, founded by St. Dominic himself. On one, they lived very, very austere lives. They had very poor food, I think. And one day the food simply gave out altogether. And so they had nothing to supper. So Dominic prayed to God, and 2 angels were sent, who not only provided a ready meal, as they would say in Mr. Sainsbury's, but even served it up themselves. Now, this is not a scene which is frequently to be seen across the road in Blackfriars. But the refectory is not so dissimilar, and you can see top left a friar reading to the brethren from a theological tone while they're eating in silence. Next, please. This is a good example of Angelico at his simplest. This is in the predella of the Cortona Annunciation. Cortona is a city in Italy where the picture is preserved in the cathedral. The main picture shows the Annunciation, but I thought this was a wonderful boil down of things like architecture and landscape. This is a visitation, the visit of Mary, both pregnant, Mary to her cousin Elizabeth. And I forget the name of the village. I've actually been there, just having one of my senior moments, but it is in rather rocky country, and I can very much from experience sympathise with this poor old lady, who's presumably the servant of the Virgin Mary, who's toiling up that rocky slope. The rocks again reduced to an almost geometrical simplicity. Look at the architecture of the city wall and its gate. Absolutely no detail whatsoever except one row of windows. No articulation of the architecture whatsoever. You concentrate on the human significance. This is an incident in the history of salvation. The setting is real. One needs to emphasize it really happened in a real place. But the detail of the setting is not important. Economy of expression can be one of Fra Angelico's fortes. Next, please. And also, as I mentioned before, how almost instinctively he seems to have got a grip on perspective very early on. This is an extraordinary example. The patron saints of the Medici, St. Cosmas and Damian, who were medics, it has to do with the pun on the name Medici, which means doctors, physicians. These two doctors they attempted to martyr them first by drowning them, but they were rescued by angels. But the point is, again, look at that simplified rocky desert, and look in particular at the extraordinary, there's a kind of sandy waste outside. And you're looking for miles, aren't you, towards a very, very distant horizon. So this capacity to project space and distance, I think, is another achievement of our artist. Remember that he began in a very conservative international Gothic workshop, if, as I believe, he was taught by Lorenzo Monaco. Next, please. Here is another feature of his work, which you would expect of a member of a learned order, is great iconographic richness, a great deal of specific theological content. So here, the Annunciation within a beautiful Renaissance loggia. Michelozzo, who rebuilt the convent of St. Mark, would have been proud of that portico. It's contrasted with a garden scene, this is Eden, from which our first ancestors are being ejected forcibly by a fierce fiery angel. Just as Christ is considered in church tradition as the second Adam, who undoes the disobedience of the first, Mary has the same relation to Eve. She's the new Eve. You probably know a very beautiful hymn to the Virgin called Ave Maris Stella, said, for example, by Monteverdi, and it contains the couplet, Yes, Sedens isti ave Gabrielis ore, mutans nomen ave firmanos in pace, which means taking that word ave from the lips of Gabriel, changing the name of Eve. That's, if you put Eve back to front, you get ave. Changing the name of Eve, you establish us in peace. Funda nos in pace. So there is the disastrous fall in the ejection from paradise, and through the Annunciation, which is the beginning of salvation, the beginning of the New Testament story, mediated through the free ascent of Mary, we have the possibility of re-entering into friendship with God, and eventually paradise will be returned. Notice also the ray coming from the top left-hand corner, where if you look carefully you can see the hand of God the Father sending the Holy Spirit to fructify the Virgin's womb. So there's a Trinitarian undercurrent here. All three persons in God are cooperating in the incarnation of Christ, in his conception. And on this golden ray, the Spirit can be just seen, a tiny white dove, descending and entering her womb. And at that second, the incarnation is realized. The seed is planted in her womb. The fetus begins to grow. This is... it is very important then to see that the Annunciation has two aspects. One is the free ascent of Mary to the divine offer of salvation as a new Eve, without which there would have been no crucifixion or resurrection. She wasn't forced to do it. And secondly, the importance of the work of the Holy Spirit as the agent of the conception of Christ. Next, please. And also, he's quite prepared to adopt unusual iconographies or subjects, including those from Greek or Eastern Orthodox sources. The typical way of showing the death, the end of Mary's life in Orthodoxy is not to show her bodily assumption, but to see Christ appearing at her deathbed to receive her soul. You can see him in the middle. So this is called in Greek chimesis, or in Latin dormitio. It's a falling asleep of the Mother of God, which is also the moment of her soul being received into glory by her Son. This is not common in Western art. It just shows that Angelico was broad-minded enough to borrow from ideas which could have been easily were introduced in Italy via portable works of art like Greek manuscripts and icons. Next, please. Now, what is the time? I must be quick. Very briefly, can I just look at one or two works in slightly greater detail? This is a separate triptych, a three-part altarpiece, showing the descent from the cross. Now, first of all, I'm being more art historical now. First of all, I draw your attention to the unification of space. Instead of compartmentalizing different moments in the scene in the three different parts of the triptych, they're all integrated. And indeed, the pathetic sag of Christ's dead body as he's being carried down from the cross goes right across to the point where the vertical pillar dividing the triptych into three would, in an earlier example, have come. Secondly, the careful orchestration of the personae, the dramatis personae within the picture frame, forming a sort of circle which projects backwards, and behind which, on the left, you can see in the left-hand arch a splendid townscape, and on the other, the picture opens out into the rather dry, rounded hills of Tuscany. Next, please.
What?
Yes, all right. Sorry, I forgot it was that. Let's see the detail. Yes. Now, I showed you earlier an example of, as it were, pared-down architecture. Very few windows, a little bit of crenellation in the city tower over the city gate, but reduced really to geometrical solids, especially cubes and pyramids, which are painted in rather delightfully surreal colours. I don't think Angelico had a lot to learn from people like Picasso and Braque when it came to reducing structure to a sort of cubistic, minimalist statement. Next, please. Very similar is another picture, the next scene, if you like, if you think of the Passion cycle as a triptych. You've got crucifixion, deposition, and the third scene, which came from the Greek East, is lamentation. This is very similar in tone. Both of these pictures show a quiet, restrained grief. Angelico is never heart on sleeve, he's never shrill, he's never operatic, but you feel it's very deeply felt. And he manages to communicate his empathy with the grief-stricken Madonna and the apostles. Needless to say, St. Dominic is snuck into the scene on the side. This is called local patriotism. Next, please. Oh, sorry, can I also point out this rather handsome Turkish carpet, which forms what the mathematicians call orthogonals. These are the sight lines which create the perspectival system, in which, if continued, would end at a point, at the vanishing point of the construction of the picture. And also, another point, a tiny, as it were, picture within a picture, like a small icon pinned onto the altar, sorry, this is a fresco in San Marco, pinned onto the front. It serves as an altarpiece, it's behind an altar, and in the place over where the cellist and pattern go, there's always meant to be either a crucifix or a crucifixion, because the whole point of the Eucharist is representing the sacrifice of which Christ made on the cross through the breaking of the bread and the pouring of the wine. That's one reason, but also, as Austin Furry used to say, if you don't have a cross, you don't get a wreath. This was after he was inspired to this one aperçu by looking in an undertaker's shop which said crosses and wreaths to order, and his point was you can't have one without the other. So this is a scene of glory. It's the worship of the Virgin and Child in the court of heaven. But this is not a moment for triumphalism, because there would be no heaven if it weren't for that. Next, please. That's the point I was making about the carpet as illustrating the perspectival construction. These orthogonals, we call those things. Next. Now I'm going to show just one or two pictures from the cells at San Marco. Now, I won't be able to do much analysis because it's getting late. This is interesting, showing his appropriation of the new kind of classical architecture being practiced by people like Brunelleschi and his pupil Michelozzo. It's a classical loggia with proper Corinthian columns and informed by proper classical proportions. The right ratio of parts of the whole is the essence of classical design, with a lovely flowering garden once again. So that's another important thing. Learning from architects who are slightly ahead of the artists in their appropriation of the classical tradition, of the painters in their appropriation of the classical tradition. Next, a very, very simple, well, it's not strictly a nativity, it's the worship of the child by the Holy Family, and believe it or not, St. Dominic. He's even got into that, he's even been off to Nazareth, or Bethlehem, I should say. Yes, absolutely reduced to the basics, just a plain piece of ground, No flowers, no trees, no frills of any sort. This is not public art. It's designed for the monastic cell, as I said earlier, of an individual Dominican. And he will pray in front of that, and he will identify himself with the praying figure of his founding father, Dominic. So economy is of the essence. You don't want to distract the mind in prayer by putting in a lot of fussy extra bits. Next, a superb and very simple transfiguration. Again, plain white underpaint, the intonaco, is being used to represent the uncreated glory of the divinity of Christ united with his humanity. For just 1 minute, the curtains are drawn, and normally this glory is hidden, but just for 1 minute, in front of 3 chosen apostles, Christ, the magnificence and glory of Christ's divinity was revealed. This is the transfiguration. Very beautifully composed within that rectangular frame with its semicircular top. Perfect symmetry, that's another feature of importance. The mount table reduced just to a very small rocky outcrop. Next, please. Now, the extreme economy here. This is the mocking of Christ. The mockers who are spitting or hitting him over the head with reeds and things, reduced to kind of visual shorthand, a spitting head, a disembodied hand about to strike his face, and so forth. And I think this is one of the, as a former Dominican, I find this the very best picture I've ever seen of St. Dominic as a model for prayerful study and what the St. Benedict would have called Lectio Divina, which is reading theological texts, and especially Scripture, not just as a textbook might be read, but as food for the spirit, which has to be chewed over. St. Benedict said it's like a cow chewing the gut. It's got to be digested and absorbed. And that's what St. Dominic is doing. Next, please. Finally, in the last 5 years of his life, Angelico was summoned to Rome by Eugenius IV, who was a friend of the Medici. He had stayed in San Marco when in disgrace as a cardinal a few years before his election as Pope. And so he asked him to decorate certain chapels in the Vatican. This one was continued under his successor, Nicholas V, and that's why it's called the Cappella Nicolina, and it shows scenes from the life of St. Lawrence, and who was a Roman deacon, and St. Stephen. I think I shall finish by just showing you this one picture. It shows St. Lawrence at the entrance to the great Lateran Basilica. It's a superb portrait of the architecture, isn't it, with those massive columns, monolithic columns, drawing the eye towards the conch of the apse, which is like a shell, can you see it? Which forms as a kind of frame for the central, most important figure, St. Lawrence, dressed as deacon and giving out money to beggars and cripples, all of them looking pretty miserable. But the mood is somewhat lifted by a delightful touch of humour. This little boy is being given a coin and his sister is trying to nick it. The little boy is looking absolutely delighted about being given a penny, which somewhat relieves the misery of the adults on either side. Magnificent recreation of late antique architecture as well. One of the great buildings of the age of Constantine. Next, please. And there is St. Lawrence receiving the goods of the church's archdeacon, the Pope giving him all the goodies to look after. And then what does he do? He gives them away to the poor. When told off about this, he replied, "But what is the treasure of the church except the poor brothers of Jesus?" Very appropriate reply. Again, I would emphasize a new solidity of architecture. the stone is solid enough to take a certain amount of architectural detail, carving, and a new robustness in the treatment of the human form. The figures are much larger in respect of the picture space than they've been before. The whole thing seems to be gaining a certain added gravitas. It becoming less ethereal, more substantial, without losing any of the other pictorial virtues, like understanding of space and perspective and proportion, or indeed anything of Fra Angelico's essential delicacy, refinement and spiritual depth. But there is a new robust quality in this last phase of his life, I think. Next, please. Also, excellent lake landscapes. If you've ever been to Jerusalem and you go outside the city walls, you can see the beginning, or you get into the Israelis built houses or whatever. You can see the bare, rocky Judean desert, and it really does look like that. Although he himself had never been there, he must have read pilgrimage accounts. Also, a very good example of how to show arrested, violent movement in a static picture. That's the stoning of St. Stephen. Finally, yes, St. Stephen preaching outside the city walls with very attentive listeners. And I think you've been very attentive listeners too. I thank you for coming, and I hope that the rest of the series will be inspiring.
Thank you. Sadly, I think we probably shouldn't go on to questions, but all I can ask you to do is once again show your appreciation for what I thought was absolutely stunning critique and devotional.
Thank you very much.
You may be glad to know that we do not require as much financially for travel expenses. Nevertheless, there are expenses attached to this series, as there always are.